Well, good evening. If you would turn in your Bibles to the book of First Peter chapter 2. For 2,000 years, Christianity has in some ways been under attack. And when we understand the importance of that, we'll understand how that's actually a good thing. Hold on just a second. There we go. When you think about the things that have happened for 2,000 years, you look at even at in the book of Acts, how the church began to be persecuted. It's always been based on the testimony of other people. It's been words that people have brought against an accusation against the church. That's how the church is persecuted. At first it was the Jewish people getting in, going to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the teachers of the law, and telling them that they heard certain things. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the teachers of the law, trying to catch the Christians in certain ideas, even trying to catch Jesus in some of his teachings so that they could prove that he was teaching contrary to Moses. And when that stopped working, they had all kinds of, especially as Christianity spread into the land of the Gentiles, they started changing their tactics. They started going to the authorities and bringing accusation against the Christians. One of the most common accusations that they started bringing very, very early on that they found out that worked was they would go to the Romans and accuse the Christians of trying to create trouble, right? And to the Roman, their ears perked up. The Romans did not like trouble. And so if you walked into their city, if you walked into a town and you caused trouble, you could be put to death for that kind of thing. It didn't always happen, but they took it very seriously. And what they feared mostly, these are the leaders and the rulers of these different villages and towns and cities. They feared the Romans, the higher ups. If they heard of outbreaks and they heard of things happening and it looked like things were going to get out of hand, they had no problem with circling the city and just killing everyone. So this was a very serious accusation. They found out that the Romans didn't really care so much if the Christians taught things that they felt was contrary to the law of Moses. They didn't really care. This was a minor dispute in their own religion. And while they tolerated the Jewish religion, they didn't really like it that much. And they certainly never saw they didn't at that time see Christianity as something that was actually competitive to Judaism. They thought it was just a part of Judaism. And so it was always accepted as just a part of it, and they didn't want to hear it. But when they started bringing accusations and they started saying things like they have another king besides Caesar, then they started getting attention that way. And then from then on, it was accusations that were being made. Even in the 2nd and 3rd century, we started seeing accusations being made. Christians were accused of marrying, having incestual relationships because they called each other brother and sister. They were accused of cannibalism because they ate the body of Jesus and drank his blood. Things that we know are completely fabricated and taken out of context, but they still were making accusations that were made. And Peter is very much aware of how important it is about what other people say about us. Now, it does matter what people think about us. I remember growing up, this was something that was talked about a lot, that the number one, if I ever saw anyone go forward, the number one reason that people went forward was because they brought shame and reproach on the church. I never hear that anymore. It's almost like that used to happen all the time and it never happens anymore anyway. It's because of a shift in what we're actually focused on. Because now it's become a matter of fact that we recognize that people are going to speak evil against us, and so it shouldn't be something that we feel bad about. But that's not true. The way people view us is very important. Now, if they view us improperly and they make false accusations, that will come out, that will come to light in time. But if their accusations are actually accurate, then we're actually hurting the cause of Christ. And when you're facing a time of persecution like they did in the 1st century, the image of the church is going to be very important in how the church grows and functions, right? And like I said, if it's an accurate statement, that's really going to hurt things. But if it's not accurate, people will be able to see through it, and they'll be able to come to the truth in spite of the false accusation. There's not any, this is what it has, I've been in situations before where people they decided for whatever reason, they wanted to say, they just wanted to run my reputation through the mud. And, you know, it was very tempting. I knew what they were saying was false. It was very tempting to go and argue every time I ever heard anyone say anything bad about me. I wanted to be up there. I mean, if you've ever had that happen to you, you're really on guard. You want everybody to know the truth. But I had to back off and realize that, first of all, I can't defend myself in every situation. But secondly, if it's not true, it will come to light. It always does. God always arranges for that to happen. We just have to trust his timing. But that really coincides with what Peter is talking about here in 1 Peter chapter 2. And I'm going to read verses 11 through 17. And he's talking here about how we as pilgrims.
Sorry, I just noticed it was after 6 o'clock.
Free in Christ. I'm trying to.
YouTube.
Sorry, I'm muting people. Those of us who are free in Christ, we have to think about the persecutions that we're facing, right? The possibilities of it. In the first century, they certainly had it. I don't know if we're going to have it now. You know, I've heard a lot of people talk about how things are getting so bad and we're going to start persecutions here. I don't see it. I've seen some places where they had persecution. I've read of places that have real persecution of Christians. We're nowhere near that. Now, I'm not saying it can't happen, but if it does happen, we need to be ready for it. So this is going to be very appropriate for us. But he's saying we as pilgrims, we're pilgrims on the earth. We're just passing through here, and because of that, we're subject to the laws of this world. But we're really not participants here in this world. We have a higher calling, right? And as pilgrims, we're actually free. We're the freest people that has ever lived because we have freedom in Christ. Okay, so as we have that freedom, we need to make sure we use that freedom in an appropriate way so that people will not be able to speak evil against us. And specifically, he's talking about here how we react to the government that is with us. Now, he talks about a lot of different categories, but tonight I want to look at that specifically. One, because I've been studying it for a little while. And two, because I think it's appropriate for us to consider our own ideas about how we're approaching life right now. I'm not going to say this as in I'm making accusations of anyone. I'm not saying anyone's doing bad, but it is good for us to remember. It's important for us to remember what our place is in this society. So if you look here in 1 Peter chapter 2, he says, "Beloved," in verse 11, "I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the visitation." Okay, that's kind of a summary statement. And really, that kind of summarizes the entire book. It tells you what this is all about. And he's going to get into specific things here. He's going to talk about the government. He's going to talk about slaves and masters and their relationship. He's going to talk about the husband and wife relationship, and several other things that he's mentioning here. And specifically at the end of chapter 3 about just suffering for doing what is right and suffering for doing what is wrong, right? So the intention of all those things together. But if you look then at what he says in verse 12, that we have our conduct honorable among the Gentiles, so then this is Gentiles, unbelievers, so that when, not if, but when they speak evil of you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. Of course, the day of visitation being ultimately the coming of Jesus. It's not that when Jesus comes back, they'll suddenly wake up and go, oh, hey, they've been right this whole time. It's that our activities, our behavior, our conduct can actually, even people who are speaking evil against us, our conduct, when they see that, can actually change them. It can actually convert them because they see something there. There's a statement that I think it was Everett Ferguson made one time, and I don't know exactly the quote, but here's the gist of it. As blood runs from the persecution of Christians, it waters the plant that grows. So the blood of the martyrs in the first century actually is most of the reason that the church grew such an exponential number. Because people saw that. They said, these people are not dying for a lie. These people are not dying for some stupid thing. They're dying for some reason. You don't just give your life for no reason at all. And people started seeing through the accusations and realizing there's something to this. Their conduct actually helped convert other people, and your conduct can too. He goes into that. It doesn't take our death. It takes the sacrifice of ourselves, though. He goes that even into chapter 3 to talk about the husband and wife relationship and how the only hope really that you wives have of ever changing your husband is for him to actually see how you live, how Jesus has changed your life. If he can see that in your life, he's going to see that there's something different there. And I say the only way. I'm just saying that's the most common way. So we have a lot of congregations that are mostly women and their husbands never do anything. The only way that the best way that you're going to reach them is they see your conduct as honorable. You have a chance. You always have a chance. I remember preaching, this was in Hope, Arkansas, and there was a lady who came for 40 years without her husband. And one day he came and kept coming. And it wasn't long till he was baptized. It took her 40 years for him to come around. But he saw her. He saw a difference in her. He saw her consistency, and it won him over. So while that's not the lesson, it is a great illustration about the fact that we as human beings, we as Christians, when people see our good works, they can glorify God also. They can be changed by how we behave. So keeping that in mind, here's an application directly related to us as Christians, related to the government that we have. Verse 13, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to the governors as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. Well, there's a lot there for us. And as I said, I'm not suggesting that any of us have done anything wrong. I'm reinforcing what we already believe, right? That this is who we should be. This is what, when in any situation and in any society, Christians should be the ones who stand out. These are the ones that should be the best case. The best case for having Christianity in any system of government should be our behavior. And in fact, it wasn't in the second and third centuries, there were people who were writing the Roman government, giving them reasons why Christianity should be seen as a proper religion, and telling them the reason that it's so important. They gave reasons why their society benefits from their being in the society, from Christians being there. And everywhere Christianity has ever been, it has always been the case that Christianity has lifted up so many different people and has helped society in so many different ways. It's always been that way. And so we have that as a great example for us, and it should be that way, right? Whether it's in our jobs or whether it's in our community, Christians ought to be there. We ought to be present. We ought to be helpers. We ought to be looking around and helping other people. That's what we do anyway, right? And it's amazing when we look at the difference between people who are religious minded versus people who are not religious minded, and how much time and money is given by both groups. And it should be something that we point to as what we're doing as well. But specifically looking here, he says, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man. Now, that's a challenging situation. Now, obviously, well, the word can also translate to institution of man. Obviously, Acts chapter 5, verse 29 comes into play, where Peter said, we must obey God rather than man. So I'm not in any way advocating that we look at, so somebody decrees that we can't do something that God tells us to do. You know what? I don't care what the government says. If God tells us we have to do something, and this is the only way it can be done, this is what we're going to do. This is what we have to be, right? But that doesn't mean that every time the government decrees something related to us, that we automatically have to kick back and say, no, you can't tell me what to do. Yes, they can. The government can tell us what to do. In fact, this Bible tells us to submit to that, as long as it's not interfering with what God says to do. So we have to use some wisdom and common sense with that. I ran across a preacher one time who told me that if he was late to a Bible study, that he had the right, the God-given authority to run every stoplight and every stop sign on the way there, because he's late. He had to be there for that Bible study because that was more important. Really? Now, what about obeying the ordinances of man? It's not the ordinances of man. It's not the law's fault that he was late, right? We don't just get to pick and choose what we obey. So we have to be very careful of that in our society. And anytime we see a law that affects us, we need to decide for ourselves. We need to decide, is this actually violating what God says? Or is it possible for me to do this and not violate what God says? If it's possible for me to do it and not violate the scriptures, I have to do it. Because this is what it says a good citizen does, a good Christian does. So we therefore submit to yourselves to every ordinance of men, for the Lord's sake, by the way, whether to the king and supreme or to governors. It doesn't matter who it is. Whether they're really high or they're really low. If they have authority over us, we listen to them and we submit to them, because that's what we do. And it's not for their sake. It's not because they're so powerful, they're so mighty, and they're so worthy. It's because we do that for the sake of the Lord. Because what we do matters. How we behave matters. People see us. They see what we're doing, and they know exactly what's going on. And they make judgments about us. And those judgments may or may not be fair. They may or may not be accurate. But we want to make sure that they're not accurate if they're bad, right? So we behave ourselves in the way God wants. And I've talked to people and they said, well, yeah, but the government's so bad. Yeah, tell that to Peter. The Roman Empire was terrible. The corruption was incredible. It wasn't very long from now that, from the writing of this, if in fact it may have already been in place where people were, Caesars were walking around calling themselves God. Now, Nero did all kinds of things. There were some rulers of the Roman Empire that were absolutely mad, and not angry. Mad, they were crazy. They did things, I can't even tell you some of the things I've read that they've done. It would be terrible, especially in a mixed audience. They would do things like, I won't get into too much detail, they would hang Christians on spikes and drench them in oil and put them in their garden and light them on fire so they can have light to see. And Peter is writing, I don't know if it's happened yet or not, but it will. Peter is writing and says, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man. That's the kind of government that we were dealing with, where we look at our president now, and yeah, he's immoral. He's said some things and he's done some things that are wrong. But if in the comparison, he's a mild-mannered man compared to a lot of the morality problems that we see in the first century. I'm not justifying anything. I'm saying if they were told in those terrible conditions to submit to the government, we should as well. We have no reason not to. And in fact, we actually have a good, strong government that actually is, for the most part, pro-religion. They are allowing us to meet. They're allowing us to have freedom of religion. And yes, some people want to encroach that, but there are a lot of other people fighting against it. So we are pretty protected right now. We have it pretty good, especially if you compare it to a lot of the rest of the world. We have it very good. So we need to make sure that we submit ourselves to every ordinance of man. For the Lord's sake, he says in verse 14, to governors, those who are sent by him, the punishment of evildoers, for the praise of those who do good. This is the will of God. He gets into verse 14. He's given kind of a reason, a rationale for why God allows the government to be there to begin with. And that we're going to look at Romans 13 in just a minute. But he says to governors, these are people who are sent for the punishment of evildoers. Okay, that's one of the purposes that God allows government. so that we don't have to worry about taking vengeance on anyone. God's going to do that through the government agencies. And then he says also that this is for the praise of those who do good. So they should be congratulating us for doing good and encouraging the goodness. And that's, in fact, what most governments are trying to do. But he says, this is the will of God in verse 15, that by doing good, you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Again, coming back to what people say. What are they saying about us? Are they going around telling people that we just do what we want and it doesn't matter what the government says? Maybe as a church, not so much. What about us as individuals? What about us as Christians? Do we obey the laws? Do we think it actually matters? I know how those Christians behave. I know really deep down. I was out with a man drinking a cup of coffee a few months ago before all this shutdown. I'm not going to get into names or details or anything, but he was telling me about a particular denomination. And he said it never fails. If you go out and there's two of them together, they never drink. If you go out with one of them, they get drunk every time. He said that's just how those people are. He had branded an entire denomination by the behavior of a few people that he knew. Do you think people do that all the time? The things that we do and the way that we behave, you may think, well, they know that not everyone's that way. But no, they will look at you and you are a subset to this church. They will look at you and say, well, if you're that way, everyone else is that same way too. That's the way it works. That's human nature, right? So Peter is telling us, you better behave. You better look at what you're doing and make sure you're doing what God said, doing what you're told to do. And that's certainly not something that I enjoy. There are a lot of times and a lot of places where I don't particularly like the speed limits, but they're there, right? I don't particularly like having to pay my taxes, but the laws are there. I don't like a lot of the things that I have to do, but they're there. So what do we do? As Christians, we decide to do what? We're going to submit ourselves to the ordinance of men. Look over in Romans chapter 13. Paul deals with this as well. And his reasoning here is similar, but he's not dealing with it, the idea of persecution quite the same way that Peter is. He's more generically speaking about how we should behave ourselves, and also speaking about vengeance and talking about how important it is that we don't take vengeance out on people because God has already arranged for that to be done. In fact, he says, vengeance is mine at the end of chapter 12 and verse 19. Vengeance is not mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. So we don't have to worry about taking vengeance on people who do us wrong. We don't have to worry about any of those kinds of things. What we should do is worry about loving those people. We're treating them well in spite of how they treat us. And we're not worried about vengeance because we put that need for justice, we put it in the hands of God. And we don't worry about it. It's his job. My job is to be good. His job is to take vengeance. And he will. And in chapter 13, he gets into a description of one of the ways that he does that. He says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Oh, man. Every 4 or 8 years, half the population hates that verse. So the other half of the population loves it, right? So when we have a Democrat president, they say this is terrible. Half of the people say this is terrible. The other half say it's great. Same thing with a Republican president, right? Oh, man, the world's falling apart. But imagine going up to someone who says, that's not my president, whether it's this one or the one before, and saying to them, that man was put in there by God. You think they believe that? They don't want to believe that, but they were. Clinton was put in there by God. Obama was put in there by God. Trump was put in there by God. I don't know how all these things work. I don't have to like it. I was never asked whether or not I liked it. I was asked to vote. But let every soul be subject to the authorities. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities in verse 2, resists the ordinance of God. Those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Rulers are not a terror to good, but to evil. You want to be unafraid of the authority, do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. Now, he's speaking generically, of course. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Now, there's a whole lot of other theology we can get into that, especially when we talk about what about nations that are terrible and things that they do are so bad. God actually has ways of doing things. In the Old Testament, we see that nations got so bad that other nations would come in and attack, and God sent them. In fact, if you look at Nebuchadnezzar, who conquered so much of the world in his time, Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, he was an emissary of God. And he knew that. And he said, God told me to go conquer the nations. And he did tell him to go conquer the nations. He didn't tell him to do all the other terrible stuff with it. He told him to conquer the nations because that was how God was dealing with it. He was exacting vengeance. He was getting vengeance on the terrible people that were living at the time. And then, because of the terrible vengeance that the Babylonians did to the people that they were oppressing, God came and brought the Persians in and destroyed the Babylonians. And then it's after that, we had the Greeks came in and destroyed the Persians. And so it's one after another after another. Why? Because God raises up people to punish other nations. He's always done that. Is he still doing it? I have no earthly idea, because the only way I know that God did those things in the past is because the Bible tells me that they did. There's no scripture to tell me he does it today. He may be doing that. I don't know. But I've wondered so many times if we're actually due an invasion or two. Have you ever thought about that? I don't want that to happen, but who knows? I'm not worried about it. My concern is, how do I live today? What is it that I'm doing now? And how is it that I'm influencing other people for the good? And specifically, as far as being a citizen of this country, we need to make sure that we are doing what we can to obey, right? That means that we're not getting inside all the gossip. We're not getting inside all of the conspiracy theories and all these things that are designed to cause us to want to rebel against a society that's trying to do its best. There's a lot of that going on around now. I mean, a lot. And my contention is, let's say that you can imagine the worst conspiracy theory that you can imagine. Let's just take it to the furthest extreme that you can imagine. And man, I've heard some whoppers. And let's say you prove that that's true, and there's people that out there that have IQs like 10,000 times better than ours. So they can connive all these great things and make it all happen. I can't organize, don't take this the wrong way, but I can't make you guys do anything. And yet somehow these great people with these huge IQs can make millions of people do everything that they want them to do. I don't know how they do it. I wish I could figure that one out. But if that's the worst case scenario, and it's absolutely true, and those are all true cases, what does that do for your life? How does that affect you? It doesn't matter. What matters is, are you faithful to God? That's what matters. And if me being obedient to the government means that I'm discomforted, or maybe even I might end up losing my life, I'm going to heaven. I'm a pilgrim here. That's the idea of 1 Peter. I'm just a pilgrim. This is not my home. I have no vested interest in this place. I'm just passing through. And sometimes we forget that, don't we? So while we're here, we do the best that we can to submit to the rulers that are over us. While we're here, we do the best that we can to make sure we operate within the fields of the functions of our different hats that we wear in the best way that we can, looking for that time when we can just drop all this stuff and walk away. And I tell you what, when I walk away from this, I will not miss it a second. I won't miss it at all. And you won't either. So we'll be in heaven. You will not miss this place in iota. We drop it and leave. I'm looking for that day. I don't care what else happens. I'm looking for that day. So if you need to respond to this, I hope that you will consider, maybe it's just making some decisions. And I may have stepped on some toes. I was aiming for the heart, but I've had to struggle with this too. I've seen things that I've become infuriated with, and on both sides of this issue of the coronavirus, for one. I've seen both sides of this. I've been infuriated both sides, and I've jumped the fence I don't know how many times trying to decide what's really going on. And I've come to the conclusion I have no earthly idea what's going on. And I'm okay with that now. But it took me a while to get there. I have no idea what's going on, and probably you don't either. There are some people that do, but I kind of doubt it's us. And if you do, I don't want to hear about it, honestly. If you can save my life, maybe you can give me a heads up. That might be okay. But anyway, if you have any needs, please let us know what we can do to help you. If you have, I don't even know what to say. I think all of us have been baptized in here. Well, there's a little boy that hasn't, but I'm not going to say that. If you need to be baptized and you're watching this program on Zoom or YouTube or Facebook Live or whatever, if there's something we can do to help you, please let us know. If there's any way we can help you all, please come as we stand and sing.